Hi everybody, Bill Grandy here from the Virginia Academy of Fencing. I just wanted to do a quick review on a product that's a little bit different than what we normally see on the market. This is a sword designed by Belsky Stageswords, and it is specifically designed for armored combat. And when I say armored combat, I'm not referencing the type of sport combat where you are striking the armor with the edge of the weapon. I'm referring to the armored combat that is seen in the historical fencing treatises, typically referring to the judicial duel, where you grab onto the middle of the blade and use it essentially like a short spear to thrust. And the idea is to get into the gaps of the armor. Now, in this style of combat, you quite often see a lot of actions where you're using the hilt to either hook onto somebody's arm, to try to disarm somebody, trying to hook onto the inside of the knee to pull, and very famously, you also sometimes see both hands on the blade using the hilt with the intent of striking full force onto somebody's helmet. That technique is known by a number of colorful names, and probably the most famous one is the term Mordschlag, which literally means murder stroke. So I had approached Belsky a while back, and I'd already worked with him on a number of projects. He is fantastic to work with. He is probably my favorite sword vendor because he really works with you to get your project the way you want it. And the big one, he is very, very professional. If he says a project's going to be done on this day, it is done on that day. His hilt work is phenomenal. He's one of the really, really talented hilt makers out there. So when I actually approached him with this, I kind of didn't actually think he would be that interested. And I kind of tossed it out there, and he was actually seemed very excited about working with me to get this done. What I wanted was a sword specifically for what we in the German arts refer to as Harnischfechten, or harness fighting, literally meaning fighting in armor. And I wanted a sword that had a number of different features, but the big one is, could I do a Mordschlag on one of my friends and not send them to the hospital? One more. I went through a lot of Tylenol testing these various different hilt types. And the thing is, as long as you have a decent helmet, these are actually great for that. They're really kind of the equivalent of a lot of different poleaxe heads that are usually made of rubber. And actually, I say the equivalent, a poleaxe is a lot bigger and can generate a lot more force. So I would actually argue that this one, while it is a little stiffer than some of the poleaxe heads out there, is actually a lot safer. And I want to emphasize, it is stiffer. We needed it to make sure that if you were trying to hook onto the arm, that if you're trying to hook onto the person's leg and pull, that really would not be a big deal, that it wouldn't just bend so much that you couldn't do these techniques. And we found there really weren't any techniques that this hindered. It is just flexible enough, right? If I really pull on it, you can see it does have some bend, but it is mostly very, very stiff. If you were to fence with these using armor techniques, but not wear any of the armor, I would say these are very, very dangerous. This absolutely could break bones if you don't wear any protection. With the armor, not really a big deal. Let's do a quick comparison between the rubber hilt and a steel one. The steel one happens to be an Ensifer. And if you look, this is a fairly typical guard that you see for a lot of tournament swords for unarmored combat. And of course, they get little nicks and burrs that happen from just general fencing. The rubber one, which is very, very wide and also has these beveled edges, can't get those nicks and burrs. And that may seem like something that's not a big deal. Once when I was doing drills with a partner, that person had gone to hook at my leg, and there happened to be a burr on theirs that was just a little bit sharper than they realized. They probably didn't even notice it was there. And when they went to hook the leg, it sliced through the fabric of my pants and sliced my leg pretty badly. Now, we were going slow enough that that was not really that big a deal, but had that been a serious fencing match where we're going at full speed, I may have ended up in the hospital. I similarly once had an issue where someone went to hook my arm, and again, we were going nice and light and slow, and it happened to slip in a tiny gap that the mail wasn't covering, and the exact same thing had happened. So that is something that is impossible to do with this nice wide guard that doesn't have any sharp edges and is also made of rubber. We tried a lot of different helmets. we tried heat-treated spring steel, we tried just regular spring steel that wasn't heat-treated, we tried 12 gauge mild steel, we tried 14 gauge mild steel, and we even tried a bunch of really crappy helmets that are essentially imported from other countries that, in general, I wouldn't recommend anyone wear, but we just wanted to see what this thing did to them. And all of the other either heavier or heat-treated helmets were fine. I'm sure that if you really tried, you probably could dent a 14 gauge mild steel helmet with this, but the truth is you'd have to be hitting really, really hard, and it probably wouldn't be that big a dent. It probably would take time before you really started to see the damage. 16 gauge, I definitely was able to put probably a 1/4 inch divot in one. That I hit that hard, and I was not brave enough to wear it. I put it on a dummy for that one. And that was really not a big deal. It was something where, yes, there was damage to the helmet. That happens to people who do SCA combat. And the truth is, 16 gauge mild steel is the minimum requirement of a number of organizations for a reason. You would survive, but you probably want something better than that. You also want to make sure you have a decent suspension liner, or at the very least really heavy duty padding, although I always recommend the suspension liner. It is much, much better. Overall, as far as striking with this hilt goes, and for that matter doing any of the hooking actions with this hilt, it's very, very safe. Now, I want to address the blade really quickly. So one of the problems with a lot of the swords on the market is that they are made of steel, and that's normally a good thing. Steel is unfortunately a little bit too flexible for what we need unless you make it too dangerous. Meaning, you have to make it thick enough, or you have to make the edges thin enough with the spine really wide, which is what a lot of historical swords are. And the truth is, after we tried a couple different blades, none of them were working out for us because most of them had too much flex. And normally that's a good thing out of armor. But when you're doing some of the actions where you have to brace this on you to press, when you're trying to drive it into your opponent's mail, when you're trying to actually push them back, when you're trying to do leveraging actions for grappling, if they're too bendy, they just don't work. And actually, in the armor, sometimes you don't even feel them. So we wanted something that's very rigid, and this does have some flex to it. If I slam this into a person in armor, they're going to feel it, but there's just enough give that it's not going to kill somebody. But they are definitely too stiff for most unarmored usage. Using aluminum allowed us to make sure we had a really, really wide edge and not actually add too much weight. And in fact, the weight on this, I haven't actually measured it, but it feels like a sword, okay? It's got a decent heft. The balance point is fairly far forward, about that much. Again, I haven't officially measured. That's, 7, 8 inches. And that leads this to be a weapon that has a little bit of heft. That's a good thing because number one, it is in the realm of historical longswords. I know a lot of people in tournaments like the really close balance points, but that is definitely historical. It also means that when you switch to doing a Mordschlag, you have a little bit more mass this way rather than here, and that makes this not hit quite as hard, which is always nice. Something Jesse did that I really liked, he riveted additional aluminum pieces to the side and rounded these off, so you have this really, really nice thick point for safety. A lot of helmets, unfortunately, have some big gaps in them. And while we always try to do our best to make sure people are aware of certain types of safety issues and what gear we use, this will mitigate a lot of that. So that's actually really, really nice to have such a wide point. We also had this designed with a little half sword grip. There's a famous dueling sword that is in the Vienna Kunsthistorisches Museum out in Austria. And it also has one of these, and that one's actually not a practice sword, it's a real sword. But you will also see some images in period treatises that show this type of grip for two people in a judicial duel. So I had originally wanted this partially as a nod to that style of sword, but it's also kind of a built-in safety feature, for lack of a better term, because when you do a Mordschlag, you have to make sure your partner doesn't try to hold the sword here and baseball bat it, because then you can generate so much more force. If you require that one hand, either hand, beyond that, okay, doesn't matter what orientation your hands are in, If one hand is here, it mitigates how much force you can put into the hilt, which is always going to be a good thing for safety's sake. So it's a nice thing that you might want to think about if you are doing armored combat and start using these. You may want to make that a rule. All in all, I am very, very happy with these swords. Honestly, Jesse was a pleasure to work with, as always. He's really always fantastic. And he really worked with me to design a sword that just is perfect for what we do. If you were worried that the blade looks a little bit too modern, he could do things to change the finish. He could probably grind these down a little bit differently to give them the illusion of having a diamond cross section. I've seen him do that for stage combat swords, and they look great, and they still retain a nice wide edge. All of that stuff would cost more money because it's more handwork for him to do. So you could negotiate that with him. But ultimately, this is a sword that I'm really, really happy with, and I hope more and more armored combat groups start using these.
All right, we're going.